The afternoon of July 18, 2009, came down warm and still over the deep northern woods of Cook County, Minnesota, with the kind of windless heat that only the Boundary Waters could produce in midsummer, the sun high and white over 1,000,000 acres of forest and water, the surface of the lakes lying flat and silver, the air heavy with the smell of pine resin and wet earth, and the distant sweetness of wood smoke from 100 remote campfires scattered across the wilderness. It was the kind of afternoon that the people of northern Minnesota waited 11 months for, and that they remembered decades later, for the strange and impossible quality of light it had carried. The Halverson family, had been holding biennial reunions at Otter Lake since 1957. The lake sat on the far western edge of the Boundary Waters, canoe area wilderness, accessible by a single gravel road that wound for 16 miles through the Superior National Forest before ending at a small private compound on the south shore. Taman. The compound was 40 acres of wooded shoreline, including a main lodge built in 1962, 8 outbuildings ranging from cabins to a boathouse, and a long wooden dock that extended 30 feet out over the dark tannin-stained water. The property had been bought by Lars Halverson, the great-grandfather of the youngest cousins at the 2009 reunion in 1956, and had been operated since then as a family-only retreat. The Halversons did not rent it out. They did not sell access. They simply used it, every 2 years, for the gathering of their growing family. The Halversons were a Norwegian-American family with roots that ran 4 generations deep into the Iron Range of northern Minnesota. The original Lars had emigrated from a small village near Bergen in 1898, at the age of 17, and had worked his way west across the Atlantic and up the lakes until he had landed a job in an iron mine in Eveleth. He had married a Norwegian girl in 1908. They had raised 5 children, all of whom had stayed in northern Minnesota. By 2009, those 5 children had multiplied into 63 living descendants, scattered across Duluth, 2 harbors, Grand Marais, the Iron Range, Twin Cities, and a handful of more distant outposts in Wisconsin, Michigan, and 1 branch that had settled in Vancouver, British Columbia. The family had grown but had not scattered. They remained, in every important way, a Minnesota family, and the biennial reunion at Otter Lake remained the heart of their identity. By the morning of July 18, 2009, the 52nd Halverson reunion had been underway for 3 days. Cars and pickup trucks had begun arriving on the previous Wednesday afternoon, filling the gravel parking area beside the lodge and spilling onto the grass. Tents had been pitched in the meadow behind the lodge. The cabins had been assigned, with the older generations getting the larger ones, and the younger families taking the smaller. The kitchen at the lodge had been operating from dawn until late evening, with the older Halverson women in particular taking over the cooking in shifts. The reunion menu was as much a tradition as the reunion itself: Norwegian meatballs on Wednesday, fish boil on Thursday, a lefse, and lutefisk on Friday, and a final all-family barbecue on Saturday evening. The schedule was loosely organized but firmly maintained. The 5 cousins were the oldest of the youngest generation. They were not the only children at the reunion. There were nearly 20 children under the age of 15 scattered across the compound that week. But they were the 5 who had grown up together at every previous reunion, who had been bonded by years of shared activities, and who had been allowed, for the first time in 2009, to undertake a single overnight camping trip together without adult supervision. They had been planning the trip for nearly 2 years. They had earned it, in the careful logic of the Halverson family, by demonstrating responsibility at the 2007 reunion, when they had taken a supervised camping trip with two uncles and had performed so capably that the uncles had recommended, afterward, that the five be allowed an unsupervised trip the next time. Ely Halverson was the oldest. He was 17 years old, the son of Mark Halverson, a mining engineer for U.S. Steel, and his wife Christine, a nurse practitioner, at the Essentia Health Clinic in Duluth. The Halversons lived in a comfortable two-story house on the east side of Duluth, on a quiet street that overlooked Lake Superior. Ely was tall, 6'1", with sandy blonde hair and the slightly serious manner of a young man who had grown up understanding that he was, by virtue of being the oldest cousin, expected to set an example. He had been accepted 3 months earlier to the University of Minnesota's College of Science and Engineering, where he planned to study mechanical engineering. He had a scholarship that covered 3/4 of his tuition. He had been saving since he was 13 to pay the rest. He worked summers at a small marine repair shop on the Duluth waterfront. He was the kind of 17-year-old who had already filed his own tax returns for 2 years. Marmon Halverson Lynn was 16. She was the daughter of Inga Halverson, principal at an elementary school in Two Harbors, and David Lynn, an environmental scientist who worked for the Minnesota Department of Natural Resources. Taryn had inherited her mother's dark blonde hair and her father's quiet, observant nature. She had been planning since she was 11 to study marine biology. Specifically, she wanted to work on the freshwater ecosystems of Lake Superior, which she had been reading about and sketching since she was old enough to understand what a watershed was. She carried, that summer, a small field journal in which she had been documenting plant and animal life around her family's home in Two Harbors. The journal had over 300 pages of notes and small, careful pen and ink sketches. She was the one of the 5 cousins who could sit perfectly still in a canoe for an hour, watching herons fish along the shoreline without ever feeling restless. Anders Halverson was 15, the natural leader of the younger group of cousins. He was the son of Pastor Eric Halverson, who led a Lutheran congregation in Duluth, and his wife Lena, who taught Norwegian at a community college. Anders had grown up in a household that valued speech, conversation, and what his father called the moral weight of choices. He was articulate beyond his years. He was also, by every account from his cousins, the easiest to get along with. The one who naturally took the role of organizing group decisions, settling minor disagreements, and keeping the peace. He had inherited his father's quiet confidence and his mother's careful precision. He had been planning to study political science when he reached college, and there had been some quiet discussion in the family that Anders might eventually follow his father into the ministry. His father had once told a colleague, the most self-possessed 15-year-old he had ever met. The colleague had not entirely understood the phrase. Eric had explained it as meaning that Anders knew, with a certainty unusual in a teenager, who he was. Wren Halverson was 13, the only girl among the 4 younger cousins, and the one who had been the most excited about the unsupervised camping trip. She was the daughter of Joel Halverson, who owned a small fishing and outfitting business in Grand Marais, and Merritt Halverson, who worked as a librarian. Tren had been a competitive swimmer since she was 9, swimming for a club team in Grand Marais, and traveling to meets across northern Minnesota and Wisconsin. She had the long, narrow build of a swimmer, and she carried herself with the particular confidence of a child who had spent more hours in the water than out of it. She also kept a notebook, a small green moleskine that she had been given for her 13th birthday in March 2009. She wrote in it almost every day. The entries were a mix of observations, lists, sketches, and what she called thinking. Short paragraphs in which she worked out questions she had been asked at school or at church. She carried the notebook everywhere. She had it with her, in a small, zippered pouch, in her backpack, when the five cousins paddled away from the compound on the afternoon of July 18, 2009. Theo Halvorsen was the youngest, 12 years old, the son of David Halvorsen, who owned a small hardware store in Grand Marais, and his wife Karen, a part-time bookkeeper. Theo was small for his age, about 4'9", with dark hair and a quietness that the family attributed to growing up as the youngest of four siblings, all of whom were older and more talkative than he was. He had been begging to go on the cousins' camping trip for 2 years. He had argued for the privilege with his father in the spring of 2009, presenting a list of reasons that he had typed up on his mother's computer. The list included his age, 12, same age Anders had been when he had first gone on a supervised cousins trip, his swimming certification, his recently earned wilderness first aid badge from the Boy Scouts, 10, and his promise to follow every instruction the older cousins gave him. His father had read the list twice. His mother had read it 3 times. They had said yes. Theo had a small wooden harmonica that his grandfather had given him for his 10th birthday. He had been learning to play it for 2 years, slowly, in his bedroom in the evenings. 10. He had it in the back pocket of his shorts on the afternoon of July 18th. The trip had been planned in careful detail. The 5 cousins had been working on the plan since early April, after the spring break visit, when they had first been told they could go. Eli had drawn up a packing list. Anders had handled the equipment inventory. Taryn had researched the campsite on the North Peninsula of Otter Lake, which had been used by the Halvorsen family for adult supervised trips for over 20 years. Tren had been responsible for the menu. 5 sandwiches each for the first night, oatmeal and dried fruit for breakfast, summer sausage and crackers for the second day's lunch. Theo, the youngest, Tay, had been given the responsibility of testing the flashlight batteries, a task he had performed 3 times in the week before the reunion. The cousins were experienced. They had all been canoeing on northern lakes since they were small children. Eli and Anders had taken canoeing safety courses through the Boy Scouts. Maren and Ren had been on canoe trips with their parents every summer of their lives. Even Theo, the youngest, had been canoeing in supervised contexts since he was 6. The plan was modest by Boundary Waters standards. A 2-mile paddle from the compound to the North Peninsula, a single overnight stay, and a return paddle the following morning. 2. The cousins were equipped with 2 17-foot aluminum canoes that had belonged to the family for over a decade. 3 tents, 1 for the boys, 1 for the girls, and 1 for gear, 2 coolers of food, sleeping bags, 2 LED flashlights with extra batteries, a small portable AM/FM radio, a basic first aid kit, and at Eli's father's insistence, a Spot satellite messenger device, a small handheld unit that could send preset check-in messages or an emergency SOS signal via satellite, regardless of cellular coverage. The Spot device had been a particular point of negotiation. The cousins had not initially wanted to carry it. Anders had argued gently, that the whole point of the unsupervised trip was to demonstrate that they could handle a routine overnight without electronic backup. Eli's father, Mark, had been firm. He had handed Eli the device personally on the morning of July 18th. He had shown him how to send us the standard "I'm okay" check-in message, Trana, which would be transmitted to all 4 sets of parents through an email and text alert system. He had shown him the SOS button. He had told Eli that he was to send the check-in message immediately upon reaching the campsite, again before going to bed, and a 3rd time the next morning before departing. Eli had agreed. The The device had been clipped to Eli's belt loop. As he climbed into the lead canoe at 4:15 in the afternoon, the cousins paddled away from the compound dock at exactly 4:15 p.m. The afternoon sun was still high over the western tree line. The lake was calm, so calm that the canoes left visible wakes that persisted for nearly half a mile behind them. 63 Halverson family members had gathered on the south shore to wave them off. Aunts and uncles, grandparents, younger siblings including Theo's 2 older sisters who had been jealous of his inclusion. The family Labrador, Pippin, had been chasing along the shoreline, barking until one of the uncles had finally caught her and brought her back to the lodge. Eli's mother, Christine Halverson, had been holding a digital camera with a telephoto lens. She had been taking photographs since the moment the cousins had begun loading the canoes. Final photograph in her sequence, taken at 4:40 p.m., showed the 2 canoes side by side paddling around the small unnamed island in the middle of Otter Lake. Eli was in the front of the first canoe, with Theo in the rear. Anders was in the front of the second canoe, with Marin behind him and Wren in the middle. The cousins had been waving back toward the compound. Theo, in particular, was waving with both hands raised high above his head, his small body twisted backward in the canoe. The photograph was sharp. The light was beautiful. Christine had developed it 3 weeks later and had framed it. It would, within 6 weeks of being framed, be reprinted on the front page of every major newspaper in Minnesota. Talon. The cousins disappeared around the far side of the island at 4:42 p.m. The compound lost sight of them. The afternoon continued at the lodge. There was a planned fish boil for that evening, and the women had begun preparations by 5. The men were unloading the day's catch from the morning's fishing trip. The younger children were playing tag in the meadow. The compound, as compounds do at the height of a reunion, was loud and warm and full of the kind of small noises that, taken together, made a family at rest. At 5:38 p.m., according to the records later retrieved from the Spot Satellite Messenger Company, Eli sent his first scheduled "I'm okay" message. The transmission was time-stamped and confirmed by the satellite. The 4 sets of parents, sitting on the porches of their assigned cabins, or in the lodge kitchen, or playing cards under a tree in the meadow, received the alert simultaneously through email or text. Eli had reached the campsite. He had set up the device. He had sent the message exactly as instructed. That was the last message ever transmitted from the spot. The 9 p.m. scheduled message did not come. Eli's father, Mark, did not immediately notice the absence of the 9 message at the time it was scheduled. He had been at the fish boil, helping clean up afterward, and he had assumed Eli had simply been busy at the campsite. He had checked his phone around 9:30. There was no alert. He had told himself the boys had probably been settling in, that Eli might have forgotten the message in the rhythm of a first night out, that he would check again in an hour. By 10:30 p.m., when there was still no message, Mark had begun to feel a faint, careful unease. He had not yet said anything to Christine. He had walked down to the dock alone in the dark and had looked north across the lake. The water was still. There was no sound from the direction of the peninsula. He had told himself that this was normal, that nothing was wrong, that Eli had simply forgotten the second check-in. He had walked back to the lodge. At 11 o'clock, Mark had spoken with his brother-in-law, Joel Halverson, Wren's father, on the porch of the lodge. Joel had immediately checked his own phone. No alert. Joel was a more experienced outdoorsman than Mark. He had operated his outfitting business in Grand Marais for over 15 years, and he had taken hundreds of paying customers into the Boundary waters. He told Mark, in a quiet voice that did not yet contain alarm, that it was unusual for the spot to fail completely. He said the device was reliable in this region. Tau. He said there was no weather to interfere with the signal. He said it would be best, in the morning, for one of the men to canoe up to the peninsula and check on the kids. Mark agreed. They decided not to wake the rest of the family. The two men sat on the porch together until almost midnight, drinking coffee that had gone cold, watching the dark lake and listening to the loons calling somewhere in the deep wilderness to the north. They did not yet know that the cousins were already gone. By dawn on July 19th, Joel and Mark were on the water. They had launched a single canoe from the compound dock. At 5:30 in the morning, paddling north toward the peninsula in the cold gray light, the lake was as still as it had been the previous evening. The eastern horizon was beginning to show the first pink streaks of sunrise above the tree line. It took them just under an hour to reach the peninsula. They beached the canoe on the small sandbar at the southern point of the peninsula, in the same spot where the family had been beaching canoes for over 2 decades. They walked up the worn footpath through the white pines toward the established campsite. What they found, when they reached the small clearing, stopped them both at the same moment. 2 of the 3 tents were partially erected. The third had not been set up. The bag containing it was lying on the ground beside the cleared tent platform. The 2 erected tents had their rainflies on, their stakes driven, but the doors were open and the interiors had been disturbed. Sleeping bags were pulled halfway out of one tent. A flashlight was lying on the ground beside the other, its lens cracked. One of the coolers was open, its contents partially scattered. Sandwich wrappers, a bag of apples, 2 unopened cans of Coca-Cola in the cold ash of a small fire ring. The fire ring contained the cold remains of a small fire. The ashes were dark and damp from the overnight dew. The fire had clearly been built, small, careful, the way Anders would have built it. But it had not been a long, burning fire. There were 2 pieces of birch bark on the edge of the ring that had not been used. On a flat rock at the edge of the campsite, Wren's green moleskine notebook was lying open. The notebook was face up, the pages slightly fluttered by the morning breeze. Joel walked over to it. He did not touch it. He bent down and read the open page. The entry was dated July 18th, 2009, at 7:42 p.m. It was in Wren's careful, precise 13-year-old handwriting, unset on otter from the peninsula. The water is going dark gold, and there are 3 loons calling from somewhere on the East Bay. Anders made a fire. Theo found a fox track on the path. We are going to eat sandwiches and then play cards. Eli sent the spot message. He says he is glad we got to do this. The entry ended there. Joel stood up slowly. He looked around the campsite. He walked to the lake's edge. The cousins' 2 canoes were not pulled up on the beach. They were not visible anywhere along the peninsula's shoreline. He turned to Mark. He said in a voice that was very quiet, that they needed to get back to the compound. Right now, the drive from the compound to the Cook County Sheriff's Department dispatch line took less than 5 minutes by satellite phone. Joel made the call from the boat as they paddled back south. Mark called Christine from the same phone. Christine called Inga Halvorsen Lynn. Inga called Eric. Eric called Joel's wife, Merritt, who was already up making coffee in the lodge. Karen Halvorsen, Theo's mother, woke at 6:30 to her husband, David, shaking her gently and telling her that she needed to sit down because something had happened. By 8 in the morning, on July 19th, 2009, the Cook County Sheriff's Department had been notified. The Minnesota DNR had been alerted, and the first Forest Service helicopter was being prepped at the Regional Aviation Station in Ely. By noon, a search for the 5 Halvorsen cousins had begun. By the morning of July 20th, the Boundary Waters had become the focus of the largest wilderness search and rescue operation In the history of northern Minnesota, Sheriff Reuben Stensley of Cook County took operational command. Stensley was 57 years old, a third-generation lawman from Grand Marais, and he had handled wilderness searches throughout his 31-year career. He had never handled one quite like this. By the end of the first full day, over 400 personnel had been mobilized. Sheriff's deputies, Minnesota State Patrol, Forest Service Rangers, DNR officers, U.S. Border Patrol agents, search and rescue teams from the Twin Cities and Duluth, K-9 units from 3 regional kennels, and volunteer searchers drawn from the Halverson family's extended network of friends, church members, and outfitters from across the region. Within 72 hours, the number of searchers had grown to over 600. The Boundary Waters presented a particular kind of challenge that few other wilderness areas in the lower 48 states could match. It was over 1 million acres in total, a tangled wilderness of more than 1,000 named lakes, hundreds of unnamed smaller waters, dense old-growth and second-growth forest, peat bogs, granite outcrops, and 70-some miles of canoe routes that connected lake to lake by short portage trails. Much of it was inaccessible by road. All of it was accessible only by canoe and on foot. A small body, or 5 small bodies, could be hidden in tens of thousands of places in such a wilderness, and many of those places would never be reached by a search team, no matter how large. Sheriff Stensley understood this. He focused his initial efforts on Otter Lake itself. The K-9 units arrived at the North Peninsula campsite by boat at noon on July 20th. They were led by a Minnesota State Patrol sergeant named Diane Holmgren, who had been working K-9 search and rescue for 19 years. Her lead dog was a German Shepherd named Solveig, with 8 years of operational experience. The handlers were given articles of clothing recovered from each of the 5 cousins' duffel bags at the compound, items their parents had retrieved, with shaking hands, from the cabins where the cousins had been staying. The dogs were given the scents. They began work at the campsite. Solveig picked up all 5 scents immediately. The other dogs confirmed her findings. The cousins had been at the campsite. The dogs followed the scents around the cleared area, past the tents, past the fire ring, and then, as a single converged trail, toward the water's edge on the south side of the peninsula. At the water's edge, the trail ended. Holmgren and her team worked the shoreline for over a mile in each direction. They worked the dogs along the peninsula's perimeter. They put the dogs onto a boat and worked them along the water's edge from the lakeside. They tried scent articles from each individual cousin separately. The dogs, every time, brought them back to the same point at the water's edge on the south side of the peninsula. And every time, the trail ended there. Whatever had happened, the cousins had gotten back into their canoes, or they had been put back into their canoes by someone else. The trail did not continue on land in any direction. The dive teams arrived from Duluth on the afternoon of July 20th. They began working Otter Lake at first light on July 21st. The lake's water was darkly tannin-stained from the surrounding peat bogs and pine forests, with visibility in the deeper sections of less than 3 feet. The divers used powerful underwater lights, careful grid patterns, and side-scan sonar mounted on small boats to map the lake bottom in detail. They worked the lake for 9 consecutive days. They found a 1947 Evinrude outboard motor that had been on the lake bottom for over 50 years. They found 3 abandoned fishing rods, 2 anchor weights, and a beer cooler from the 1980s that had presumably been dropped from a boat. They found no canoes. They found no human remains. They found no gear from the cousins' camping trip. The aerial searches continued throughout late July. 3 Forest Service helicopters and 2 U.S. Border patrol helicopters with infrared imaging flew daily patterns over the Otter Lake area and the surrounding wilderness. The infrared imaging produced no heat signatures consistent with human survivors. The visual searches identified nothing unusual. No overturned canoes drifting in remote bays, no smoke from unexpected fires, no human movement in places it should not have been. The ground searches expanded outward into the neighboring lakes. Snake Lake to the north, Loon Lake to the east, Grand Portage Lake to the west. Dozens of smaller, unnamed lakes connected to Otter by short portage trails. Searchers paddled deep into the wilderness for days at a time, calling the cousins' names through old-growth forests where no human voice carried for more than 100 yards. They walked portage trails that had not been walked in a decade. They camped in the bush, working from sunrise to sunset, eating cold food because they could not stop to cook. By the end of the first week, the search had covered over 400 square miles. By the end of the second week, it had reached the boundaries of Quetico Provincial Park on the Canadian side, where Canadian authorities had joined the search effort. By July 31st, the operation had become the largest single-incident search in the history of the Minnesota DNR. Nothing was found. Not a paddle, not a life jacket, not a piece of gear, not a footprint, not a single physical trace of the 5 cousins, or their 2 canoes beyond the disturbed campsite on the North Peninsula. The dogs had told the searchers what had happened. The cousins had gotten back into their canoes, but the canoes themselves had simply vanished from the lake and from every connected waterway. From the entire wilderness, the parents stayed at the compound. All 4 sets. They did not leave. They moved into the main lodge by the end of the first week, because the cabins had become unbearable. Each cabin had been the cabin of one of the 5 cousins for the previous 5 days. And the empty bunks and unmade beds and small possessions still scattered in each room were more than the parents could face. They slept in shifts in the lodge, on couches and air mattresses. They ate when they remembered to eat. They were brought food by the church groups that had organized within 48 hours of the disappearance. By Eric Halverson's congregation in Duluth, by Inga Halverson Lynn's school community in Two Harbors, by Joel and Merritt's friends in Grand Marais, and by dozens of other small groups across northern Minnesota who knew the family and had decided, without being asked, to help. The grandparents and other adult relatives remained at the compound as well, in shifts. Lars Halverson, the grandfather of the cousins, named for his own grandfather, was the oldest Halvorson at the reunion. He was 76 years old. He had lost his wife to cancer 8 years earlier. He sat on the lodge porch through most of the first 2 weeks, looking north across the lake, saying very little. His 3 living siblings, all in their 70s and 80s, sat with him, too. The press arrived within 72 hours. By the end of the first week, news vans from every major Minnesota station were parked along the gravel road that led into the compound. National outlets followed. CNN sent a crew on July 26th. 48 Hours sent a producer on the 28th. The story: 5 cousins, ages 12 to 17, vanished from a family reunion in the Boundary Waters, was the kind of story that captured American attention in a particular way. The cousins' faces appeared on every newscast in the country. By the end of the second week, the press did not enter the compound itself. The Halversons had asked the sheriff's department to keep the gravel road closed at a checkpoint a quarter mile from the property entrance. Sheriff Stensley had agreed. The press was given access to occasional briefings at a designated meeting point near the road's end, but they could not approach the families directly without invitation. A few of the parents agreed to brief, careful interviews. Mark Halverson gave one to Carrie 11 from Minneapolis on July 26th. He stood at the dock, with the empty lake behind him, and asked anyone with information to come forward. He did not cry on camera. He had been told by Christine that he should not cry because they needed people to take the case seriously, train, and that crying parents were sometimes dismissed by the public as victims rather than as advocates. He had agreed. He had cried before the interview, in the bathroom of the lodge, and he had cried after the interview in his car, but he had not cried during the interview itself. The official search was scaled back on August 4th, 2009, 17 days after the disappearance. Sheriff Stensley held the formal press conference at a small clearing near the compound entrance, with the 4 sets of parents standing together behind him. He read a brief statement. He said, the active search was being suspended. He said the case remained open and would be pursued indefinitely. He said the Halverson family had the full and continuing support of every law enforcement agency that had been involved. He took 6 questions. When a reporter asked him what he believed had happened, he was silent for a long moment. He said, eventually, that he did not know. He said it was the most baffling case of his career and that it was, to his knowledge, the most unprecedented disappearance in the history of the Boundary Waters. The reporter asked a follow-up. Do you believe they are alive? Sheriff Stensley did not answer for a long time. He looked at the families behind him. He looked back at the reporter. He said, finally, that he could not answer that question. He said he was sorry. The press conference ended. The Halversons went back to the compound. The press packed up their vans. By the morning of August 5th, the gravel road was quiet for the first time in 2.5 weeks. The Halversons stayed at Otter Lake for another 6 days. They were preparing themselves slowly to leave the place where the cousins had vanished. They had not been able to bring themselves to leave during the active search. They were not yet able to leave now. They were trying. On the morning of August 11th, 2009, 24 days after the cousins had paddled away from the dock, the 4 sets of parents drove back down the gravel road and out of the wilderness for the first time. They drove slowly. They were silent. The road behind them, when they finally reached the paved highway and turned south toward Grand Marais, was empty. The first chapter of the case was over. The next chapter, the long chapter, was about to begin. In the weeks and months that followed the suspension of the active search, the investigation expanded in every direction, and the case settled into the slow rhythm of every major unsolved mystery, a steady, methodical effort to identify possible explanations, to follow every plausible lead, and to exhaust every theory until something definitive emerged. With the Halverson case, that something definitive would not emerge for 15 years. 3 primary theories were developed and pursued, each by different investigative agencies and each with varying degrees of seriousness. The first theory was that all 5 cousins had drowned together, that some kind of catastrophic accident on the lake, possibly a sudden squall or a single large wave from an unusual cause, had capsized both canoes simultaneously and had taken all 5 cousins under in the chaos. This theory, although it was the simplest and the most consistent with the absence of any sign of foul play, was complicated by several serious problems. The first problem was the weather. The National Weather Service records for the entire region for July 18th and 19th, 2009 showed calm conditions throughout. The wind speed at the nearest weather station, at Tofty, 23 miles southwest, had not exceeded 8 miles per hour at any point during the relevant window. There had been no storms, there had been no recorded thunderstorm activity within 50 miles of Otter Lake. The lake itself, when the search teams had arrived on the morning of July 19th, had been mirror flat. The second problem was the experience level of the cousins. All 5 were experienced canoeists. They had been trained individually in standard safety practices, including how to right a capsized canoe and how to assist other paddlers in the water. Even in a worst-case capsize, the most likely outcome would have been 5 cousins in the water with 2 overturned canoes, not 5 cousins vanishing without trace. The third problem was the absence of any physical evidence. In 9 days of intensive diving and sonar work, the lake had given up nothing. No canoes, no paddles, no life jackets, no bodies. Drowned bodies in northern lakes did not always surface. Partial recovery of equipment was the norm. The complete absence of any physical evidence in a lake that had been so thoroughly searched was, in the words of one of the lead DNR divers, statistically implausible. The drowning theory was kept on the books, but by early autumn 2009, it was no longer considered the lead theory. The second theory was abduction theory. This theory required the existence of a person, or persons who had reached the cousins on the North Peninsula of Otter Lake in the relatively brief window between the time they sent the 5:38 p.m. spot message and the time the 9:00 p.m. message would have been sent. The window was approximately 3.5 hours. The peninsula was accessible primarily by water. There was a difficult and rarely used hiking trail that approached it from the north, but it would have required a hike of nearly 6 miles from the nearest road, and there was no evidence that anyone had used that trail in the days surrounding the disappearance. The water access could have been by canoe, kayak, motorboat, 2-oar, and this was a possibility that emerged early in the investigation. Floatplane. The boundary waters had several small lakes that, despite being officially within a no-motor zone, were known to be used occasionally by small floatplanes for hunting, fishing, and backcountry guiding. Most of these uses were legal. Some were not. The FBI's Minneapolis field office, which had become involved in the case formally on July 23rd, took the lead on the abduction theory. Special Agent Carla Mottinger was assigned as the lead federal investigator, She was 44 years old, an 18-year veteran of the Bureau, and she had worked on several high-profile missing persons cases in the upper Midwest. She was a careful, methodical investigator with a particular reputation for cold cases. Mottinger began with a complete inventory of every floatplane known to operate in or near the boundary waters. There were 23 registered floatplanes within a 100-mile radius of Otter Lake. Each one was identified, located, and its activity on July 18, 2009 was investigated. By the end of August, 21 of those floatplanes had been definitively cleared, either by flight log records, by witness corroboration, or by physical inspection of the aircraft. 2 remained on the list of interest, both of them owned by individual operators with limited documentation. The first of those 2 operators was a man named Cliff Tobetz, 61 years old, a retired bush pilot who lived alone on a small lake outside Ely. Tobetz had no criminal record. He had been a respected member of the local Pilots Association for 30 years, cooperated fully with the FBI's inquiries, provided log records that accounted for his movements on July 18th. He had been on a fishing trip with a friend who corroborated his story, and was cleared by mid-September 2009. The second operator was a man named Verlin Alquist. Alquist was 54 years old in 2009. He owned a small floatplane, a 1976 Cessna 180, that he operated out of a private dock on a small lake called Pickerel Lake, roughly 19 miles southwest of Otter Lake. He had purchased the plane in 2002 and had registered it under his own name. He lived on a 160-acre property that included a small cabin and the dock where he kept the plane. The property had been in his family since the 1940s. He was unmarried. He had no children. He lived alone. He also operated on a quiet and largely unadvertised basis, a small backcountry guide service. He took paying clients on hunting and fishing trips into remote sections of the Superior National Forest, often by float plane. 10. The service was not formally licensed by the state. He worked entirely on cash. He took referrals through word of mouth. 2A. When Special Agent Mottinger began investigating Alquist in late August 2009, she found something that significantly elevated her interest. Talquist's name appeared in a confidential FBI database under a category of individuals associated with crimes of interest who have been subject to expunged or sealed records. 2. The notation referred to a 1991 case in which Alquist had been charged with the abduction and assault of a 17-year-old boy he had taken on a hunting trip in northern Wisconsin. Charge had resulted in a conviction. Alquist had served 4 years in a Wisconsin state prison. Conviction had been expunged from his public record in 2003 under a Wisconsin statute that allowed the sealing of certain older convictions after the completion of probation requirements and a clean record for 10 years. The expungement meant that Alquist's record, when run through standard background checks, came back clean. But the FBI's confidential database had retained the original information. Mottinger interviewed Alquist for the first time on September 11, 2009. He met her at his cabin on Pickerel Lake. He was a tall, lean man with a graying beard and the weathered face of someone who had spent 30 years working outdoors. He was polite. He answered her questions without hesitation. He said he had not been near Otter Lake on July 18, 2009. He said he had been at his cabin all day, working on the float plane's engine. He said he had no witnesses to confirm his whereabouts because he had been alone. Mottinger asked him directly whether he had had any knowledge of the missing Halverson cousins. He said no. She asked whether he would be willing to take a polygraph examination. He said no. He said he had been polygraphed once in 1991, and he did not believe in the technology, and he would not submit to one again. Mottinger thanked him. She left. She did not, however, leave him alone. Over the following 9 months, the FBI conducted 6 formal interviews with Verlin Alquist. They obtained 2 search warrants for his property, executing them in October 2009 and again in March 2010. They examined his float plane, his cabin, his outbuildings, his vehicles, and his financial records. They interviewed every former client of his backcountry guide service that they could identify. They interviewed his sister, Margaret Alquist, who lived in Ely. They interviewed 3 former girlfriends. They interviewed his neighbors. They monitored his movements, with what surveillance resources they could allocate to the case, for nearly 2 years. They found no physical evidence connecting him to the Halverson cousins. They found no witnesses who placed him at Otter Lake on July 18th. They found no flight log entries that they could prove were falsified. They found a man who lived a quiet, isolated, careful life, who had no apparent contact with anyone outside a small circle of clients and family, and who appeared, in every measurable way, to be exactly what he claimed to be. But the agents who interviewed Alquist came away from each session with the same impression. Mottinger documented it in her file in March 2010. She wrote that Alquist answers each question without hesitation and without inconsistency. He appears prepared for every line of inquiry. His answers are not unnaturally rehearsed, but they are unnaturally complete. He never volunteers information. He never appears nervous. He never shows surprise. In 19 years of interviewing, Ty have never met a person who handled federal questioning with this degree of preparation. He knows something. I do not believe I will be able to prove what. The note was prescient. 10. It would also be, in some ways, the last meaningful note in the active phase of the investigation. The third theory was the one the investigators pursued most quietly. Teat. It held that the cousins had been killed by someone within the Halverson family itself. That some kind of internal conflict, or some long-buried family secret, 10, had led to a coordinated act of violence that had been concealed within the chaos of the reunion. The theory was investigated thoroughly through the autumn of 2009, in part because every plausible theory had to be investigated, and in part because investigators had learned, through long experience, that the explanation of a missing persons case often lay closer to the family than anyone wanted to admit. 3. The investigation interviewed every adult Halverson who had been present at the reunion, 53 adults in total. They examined the family's history, its internal dynamics, its financial arrangements, and any disputes or tensions that had existed in the years leading up to 2009. The investigators found, predictably, the kinds of tensions that existed in any large extended family. There were old disagreements about the use of the compound. 2a. There was a long-running dispute about how the family land would be inherited after the deaths of the eldest siblings. 2a. There was a quiet rift between two of the cousins' parents, Mark Halverson and his brother Joel, over a business arrangement that had soured in 2005. There were the standard awkward pairings that came from 40 years of marriages and divorces and remarriages. But there was no motive, there was no opportunity, there was no evidence of any kind. The Halverson family, by every account, was a normal family. A family that loved each other in the ordinary imperfect ways that families love each other. A family that, in the days following the disappearance, had pulled together in a way that no investigator who watched them could doubt was genuine. Theory. The internal conflict theory was set aside by late November 2009. It would never be entirely closed, but it would never produce any new investigative direction. By the spring of 2010, the case had gone quiet, in the way that all large unsolved cases eventually go quiet. The lead investigators had not given up. Mottinger and Sheriff Stensley both kept the case active in their portfolios. But the public attention had faded. The press had moved on. The amateur theorists on online forums had run out of speculation. The Halverson family had not gone quiet. In November 2009, just over 3 months after the disappearance, the families had established the Five Cousins Foundation, a private nonprofit dedicated to funding continued investigation, supporting families of missing persons in wilderness areas, Terrigia, and advocating for legislative reform of unregistered backcountry properties and unlicensed guide services. The foundation had been initially funded by a personal contribution of $250 from the extended Halverson family. By the end of 2010, it had raised nearly $700,000 through public donations and small grants. By 2015, the foundation would have raised over $3.2 million. The foundation funded a private investigator named Russell Dahlberg, a retired Minnesota BCA agent with 30 years of experience in homicide and missing persons cases. Dahlberg was hired on a part-time consulting basis in early 2010. He worked the Halverson case for the next 12 years. The foundation also funded, over the years, a series of additional searches of Otter Lake using progressively more sophisticated technology. In 2012, a side-scan sonar survey was conducted by a contractor from Duluth. In 2015, a magnetometer survey was added to the sonar work. In 2018, the foundation contracted with a Norwegian company, that specialized in lake bottom mapping for offshore engineering applications. The company brought equipment that had never been used in a U.S. inland waters search before, a combination of high-resolution sonar, magnetometers, and ground-penetrating radar that produced, over the course of 4 weeks, a complete map of Otter Lake's bottom topography to a resolution of less than 6 inches. The 2018 survey found nothing related to the case. No canoes, no metal items, consistent with the cousins' gear, no human remains. The lake, by every available technological measurement, did not contain the cousins. 10. This single fact, that the lake had been searched as thoroughly as any lake in the country had ever been searched, and that nothing had been found, gradually became the central, haunting feature of the case. If the cousins were not in the lake, where were they? The Foundation funded ground searches of remote portage trails. The Foundation funded interviews with every backcountry resident within 50 miles of Otter Lake. The Foundation funded a forensic geological study conducted in 2016 by a hydrogeologist from the University of Minnesota Duluth that examined the possibility of underwater caves or sinkholes connected to the lake. The study found no such features. Otter Lake was a standard glacial lake with no subsurface drainage and no submerged caves. Whatever had happened to the cousins, the lake had not swallowed them. The Halverson families changed during these years, in the ways that families of the missing always change. Mark and Christine Halverson, Eli's parents, divorced in February 2012. The divorce was not bitter. They had simply, by their own quiet account to each other, run out of the particular kind of love that allowed two people to share a home after losing a child together. They remained on good terms. They both stayed deeply involved in the Foundation. Christine moved to Minneapolis in 2013 and took a position at a research hospital. Mark stayed in Duluth. David Lynn, Marin's father, took a sabbatical from his work at the DNR in late 2009 and never returned. He spent the next several years writing a series of essays about loss, grief, and the natural world, which were published in small Minnesota literary magazines and eventually collected into a book in 2017. The book was called The Quiet Lakes, sold modestly, but was widely read in northern Minnesota. Inga Halverson. Lynn continued her work as an elementary school principal until her retirement in 2019. She and David remained married, too. They moved to a small house on Lake Superior, outside Two Harbors in 2014. Eric Halverson, Anders's father, the Lutheran pastor in Duluth, went through what he later described in his published memoir as a quiet crisis of faith in the years following the disappearance. He continued to lead his congregation. He continued to give sermons. He continued to perform funerals and baptisms and weddings. But he wrestled, in private and eventually in print, with the question of how to believe in a God who allowed 5 children to vanish from a family reunion. His memoir, The Wilderness Between Us, was published in 2017 and received unexpected critical attention. He gave a single national television interview about it on a religious programming network in early 2018. He did not give another. Lena, his wife, supported him through the years, but did not write about the case herself. Joel and Merritt Halverson, Wren's parents, became deeply involved in advocacy work. Merritt, who had been a librarian, transitioned to a full-time role with the Five Cousins Foundation in 2014. She managed the Foundation's communications, fundraising, and outreach. Joel continued to operate his outfitting business in Grand Marais, but he reduced its scope significantly. He could not bring himself to take large family groups into the Boundary Waters anymore. He focused on smaller adult trips. He volunteered every summer with the Cook County Sheriff's Department's Search and Rescue Training Program. David and Karen Halverson, Theo's parents, became, in some quiet way, the most damaged of the four families. Theo had been their youngest. He had been the one they had argued about letting go on the trip. Karen, in particular, never recovered from the decision. She left the bookkeeping work she had been doing in 2011 and spent the next several years in and out of depression treatment. She found, eventually, a measure of stability through a grief support community at a small church in Grand Marais. David kept the hardware store running. He and Karen stayed married. Their three older children, Theo's siblings, went on with their lives. The two older sisters, who had been jealous of Theo's inclusion in the camping trip, would, in the years that followed, carry that small, terrible memory with them in ways neither of them could ever fully articulate. The annual Halverson family reunions continued, but they were moved to a different location after 2009. The families could not bring themselves to return to the compound for a full reunion. The compound was sold by the family trust in 2014, with the proceeds going to the Five Cousins Foundation. But every 2 years, on July 18th, what remained of the immediate family returned to Otter Lake for a single day of remembrance. They drove up the gravel road. They walked down to the dock. They paddled out to the small memorial dock that the Forest Service had allowed them to construct on the North Peninsula, near the site of the cousins' last campsite. The memorial dock was a simple wooden platform, about 10 feet by 15 feet, built by Joel Halverson himself with help from his brothers in the summer of 2010. On the dock, the families had placed 5 wooden canoe paddles, one for each cousin paddle. The paddles had been carved by hand by a Norwegian woodworker in 2 harbors, who had refused payment. Each paddle bore one cousin's name and date of birth. The paddles were weathered after 15 years. They were still there. Several false leads emerged over the years. In June 2013, a hiker found a child's flashlight in a stream 40 miles from Otter Lake, near the Canadian border. The flashlight was a model similar to the ones the cousins had carried. It was photographed, retrieved, and tested. The serial number did not match any of the flashlights from the cousins' gear, which had been documented in the 2009 investigation. The flashlight belonged to no identified missing person. It was filed as an unrelated find. In October 2016, a woman in British Columbia, Canada, contacted the Vancouver Police Department and claimed to be Maren Halverson Lynn. She was approximately the right age. She had a story, partial memories, a sense of having grown up elsewhere, a claim that she had been taken from her family in 2009 and held in unclear circumstances before escaping. The Vancouver police contacted the FBI's Minneapolis field office. Special Agent Mottinger, by then nearing retirement, flew to Vancouver to interview her. The woman was not Maren. She was a 32-year-old Canadian citizen named Therese Loubier, who had a history of mental illness and who had read about the Velvorson case in a magazine in a public library. She was not a malicious actor. She was, the consulting psychiatrist later concluded, sincerely confused. A DNA sample was taken with her consent. The result, returned 5 days later, confirmed she was not Maren. The Lynn family was notified twice. First when the contact was made, and again when the DNA results came back negative. Inga Halverson Lynn took the second call in the kitchen of her Two Harbors home. She had been making lunch when the phone rang. She did not return to the lunch. She sat at the kitchen table for the entire afternoon, looking out the window at the lake. David found her there when he came home that evening. He sat down beside her. They did not speak for nearly an hour. In September 2019, a sonar hobbyist from Iowa posted a YouTube video claiming to have found canoe debris in a remote lake 15 miles north of Otter Lake. The hobbyist had been conducting recreational sonar scans of small Boundary Waters lakes during a vacation. He claimed his scan had picked up two elongated metal objects on the bottom of a small lake called Brule Pond, consistent with the dimensions of a 17-foot aluminum canoe. Tampered. The Cook County Sheriff's Department, in coordination with the Five Cousins Foundation, organized a dive operation on Brule Pond in early October 2019. The divers recovered, from the lake bottom, an old aluminum fishing boat from the 1970s that had been abandoned there decades earlier. The boat was not connected to the case. The hobbyist apologized publicly. The Halverson families had been notified on the day of the dive, and again, 4 days later, when the recovery confirmed the find was unrelated. In 2020, during the pandemic, true crime podcast called The Five at Otter released a 12-episode series on the case. The podcast was produced by an independent journalist from Minneapolis named Emil Strand, who had been working on the project for 2 years. The podcast was thorough, well-researched, and respectful. Strand had interviewed all 4 sets of parents extensively, with their cooperation in exchange for an agreement that no episode would be released without their review. The podcast reached over 4 million listeners. It triggered another wave of public attention and produced hundreds of new tips to the Cook County Sheriff's Department, none of which led to any new developments. The podcast did, however, do one important thing. It kept the case alive in public memory at a time when it might otherwise have been forgotten. The Halverson families, too, despite the painful experience of having their story retold in 12-hour-long episodes, ultimately agreed that the podcast had served the case. Verlin Alquist, the prime suspect, continued to live on his property at Pickerel Lake. He continued to operate his small backcountry guide service. In 2014, he was arrested and convicted of an unrelated crime, an assault on a young guide who had worked briefly for him in the summer of 2013. The young guide, 22-year-old, from Grand Marais, named Tyler Sorensen, had told local authorities that Alquist had physically threatened him during a dispute over wages, and had then, after Sorensen had walked off the job, sent him a series of threatening voicemail messages. The voicemails were recorded. The case went to trial. Alquist was convicted of misdemeanor assault and felony witness intimidation. He received a 5-year sentence at a Minnesota State Correctional Facility. While Alquist was in prison, FBI agents interviewed him 3 times about the Halverson case. Each interview was conducted with the careful approval of Alquist's attorney. Each interview produced nothing useful. Alquist maintained that he had no knowledge of the Halverson cousins, that he had never been near Otter Lake on July 18, 2009, and that he had nothing to add to his previous statements. The agents documented the interviews. They filed them. They did not press further. Alquist was released from prison in 2018, having served 4 years of his sentence. He returned to his property at Pickerel Lake. He resumed his backcountry guide service on a reduced scale. He lived quietly for the next 3 years. He died of a heart attack at his cabin on April 6, 2021. He was 66 years old. He was found by his sister Margit, who had not heard from him in 2 weeks and had driven out to check on him. His property was searched a final time by the FBI and the Minnesota BCA after his death in late April 2021. The search was thorough. Every building, every storage shed, every vehicle, every document. They found nothing connecting him to the Halverson cousins. Whatever Verlin Alquist had known, if anything, had died with him. By the spring of 2024, the case was officially classified as cold by the Cook County Sheriff's Department. Sheriff Stensley had retired in 2018. His successor, Sheriff Mara Tellefson, a 43-year-old who had grown up in Grand Marais and had served as a deputy under Stensley for 12 years, inherited the case file. She had read it carefully. She had visited each of the 4 families personally in her first year as sheriff. She had not been able to give them any new information, but she had wanted them to know that the case had not been forgotten. The annual remembrance at Otter Lake continued. In July 2024, on the 15th anniversary of the disappearance, all 4 sets of parents made the trip to the lake together. Mark Halverson and Christine Halverson, divorced since 2012, drove up together from Minneapolis, where Christine still lived. They had remained close. They had developed, over the years, the particular kind of friendship that 2 parents who had lost a child together sometimes developed after a divorce. They had not remarried, either of them. The families paddled to the memorial dock together. They placed flowers on the 5 wooden canoe paddles. They sat in silence for nearly an hour on the small platform, looking south across the lake toward the compound where the reunion had been held. The compound was now owned by a new family, who had bought it from the family trust in 2014. The new owners had been respectful. They had allowed the Halvorsons to visit on the anniversaries with advance notice. They had not changed the dock or the meadow or the lodge significantly. The family paddled back across the lake in the late afternoon. The water was calm. A loon called from somewhere in the eastern bay. They reached the south shore at sunset. They returned to their cars. They drove back down the gravel road. The case had been quiet for 15 years. The lake had given up nothing. The forest beyond the lake, 1 million acres of wilderness, had given up nothing. The 4 families had aged. Some of them had moved. Some of them had divorced. Some of them had written books and given interviews and built foundation and pressed legislators for reform. All of them had carried, every day for 15 years, the impossible weight of not knowing. None of them knew that on the cold morning of October 9, 2024, a forest logger named Kjell Onstad would walk through a stand of young aspen in a remote section of the Superior National Forest, 17 miles southwest of Otter Lake, and would see something through the trees that did not belong, and that the long silence was about to break in a way that no one in the Halverson family, and no one in northern Minnesota, had ever allowed themselves to imagine. The morning of October 9, 2024, came up cold and gray over the Superior National Forest, with the first hard frost of the autumn, silvering the fallen leaves and a thin layer of mist hanging in the lower valleys until almost 10 o'clock. The temperature had dropped to 26 degrees overnight, and even by mid-morning the air remained cold enough that breath was visible. The forest was in its full autumn coloration, the birches and aspens having mostly dropped their yellow leaves, the maples still holding their last red, the conifers, woodpine, red pine, black spruce, balsam fir, providing the deep green backdrop against which the deciduous trees stood in their final stages. Kjell Onstad arrived at his current logging site at 7:15 in the morning. He drove his pickup truck along a Forest Service road that branched off a paved county highway 4 miles to the south, climbing slowly through dense, second-growth forest, until he reached a small clearing where his company had established its operations base for the current harvest. He was alone, too. The 2 other members of his harvest crew were not scheduled to begin work for another 3 weeks. Kjell's task for the next month was to complete the timber crews and harvest planning for the 240-acre parcel before the heavy equipment was brought in. Kjell was 51 years old. He was a 3rd-generation Minnesota logger, the son of a logger and the grandson of a Norwegian-born logger who had emigrated to the Iron Range in 1923. He had been working in the woods professionally since he was 23. He had worked for North Star Forest Products, a Minnesota timber company based in Duluth, for the past 19 years. 10. He held a forestry degree from the University of Minnesota Duluth and had spent 2 decades developing the particular kind of expertise that long-term timber cruisers cultivated, an ability to walk through a section of forest and assess, within minutes, the species composition, the standing volume, the harvest potential, and any features that might complicate or shape the upcoming work. Kjell was a quiet man. He had been married to his wife Astrid for 28 years. They lived in a small house outside 2 harbors. They had no children. Astrid had been unable to conceive, 10, and they had decided in their early 30s not to pursue adoption. They had instead built a life around their work, their dogs, and a small circle of close friends. Kjell was the kind of man who could go an entire day in the woods without speaking to another person and would return home in a good mood. He had been doing exactly that on most working days for nearly 3 decades. The harvest parcel he was working that fall was one of the more remote sections that North Star had been awarded under its long-term Forest Service contract. The parcel sat on the far western edge of the Superior National Forest, in a region that had been mostly untouched by human activity since the original logging operations of the 1920s. The second growth forest that had come up since was thick, dark, and difficult to navigate. 10. The terrain was rugged, a series of low ridges and narrow ravines cut by glacial meltwater thousands of years ago, with dense understory of young aspen, mountain ash, and clusters of moosewood. There were no marked trails through the parcel. There were no other human residents within 5 miles. The nearest Forest Service road was the one Kjell had driven in on, which ended at the operations base, where he had parked his truck. The timber crews had been underway for 2 weeks. Kjell had been working a methodical grid across the parcel, walking pre-marked lines, recording tree species and diameters at sample points, noting any features that the harvest plan would need to account for. 2. He had covered approximately 60% of the parcel by the morning of October 9th. The section he was working that day was the western portion, a roughly 40-acre area that sloped gently down toward a small creek that drained into a chain of unnamed beaver ponds, about a mile to the west. He had carried his standard timber cruise equipment that morning: a diameter tape, a clinometer for measuring tree heights, a Biltmore stick, a small ribbon flagging kit, a compass, a topographic map of the parcel in a waterproof case, his satellite phone, a thermos of coffee, and a sandwich for lunch. He had also carried, as he always did, a small buck pocket knife in his right front pocket and a small first aid kit in his day pack. The first aid kit had been a gift from Astrid sometime in the late 1990s and had not been opened in over 20 years. He had once joked to a friend that the day he opened it was the day he was probably going to die in the woods. He set off from his truck at 7:30 in the morning, walking west along a flagged grid line he had established the previous afternoon. 10. The line ran for about a quarter mile through dense forest before crossing a small ridge and dropping into a shallow ravine. The walking was slow. The understory was thick with downed deadfall and clinging vines of bittersweet. Kjell had to step carefully to avoid both turning an ankle and disturbing the wildlife that used the area heavily. He had seen, in the past 2 weeks, evidence of black bear, white-tailed deer, moose, fisher fox, and at least 1 bobcat. He worked the grid for nearly 4 hours. He measured trees, he recorded species. He flagged a few specimens for later inspection. A particularly large red pine he wanted to revisit, a stand of paper birch that was showing signs of bronze birch borer infestation. The morning was cold. But the work was steady, and by 11 o'clock he had warmed enough to take off the outer layer of his jacket. At approximately 11:20 a.m., he was working along the northern edge of a small ravine on the western edge of the parcel. The ravine was narrow, maybe 20 feet across at its widest, and shallow enough that he could see across it through the trees on the other side. He had stopped at the edge to record a measurement on a balsam fir. He noted the diameter. He looked up to identify the next sample tree along his grid line. That was when he saw it. Through a gap in the trees on the opposite side of the ravine, about 150 feet away, something caught his eye that did not match the rest of the forest. The shape was wrong. It was too straight. The forest he had been walking through for 2 weeks was composed entirely of organic shapes: tree trunks, branches, fallen logs, the gentle curves of the terrain itself. There were no straight lines in a healthy second-growth forest. But through the trees, ahead of him, Kjell could see a single, distinct, perfectly horizontal line about 4 feet above the ground. He stood very still for a moment. He had been a timber cruiser for 28 years. He knew, in the way that experienced woodsmen knew, when something in the forest did not belong. Set down his clipboard. He walked closer. He crossed the small ravine, careful on the steep sides. He pushed through a stand of young aspen, the dry leaves crackling underfoot. He climbed up the opposite bank. The horizontal line he had seen through the trees became, as he approached, clearer in its detail. It was the top edge of a low wooden wall. He emerged from the aspen into a small natural clearing. The clearing was perhaps 30 yards across, set in a slight bowl-shaped depression in the forest floor. The bowl was almost invisible from any distance, completely enclosed by dense forest on all sides, with no obvious approach trails, no clear sight lines, no features that would have drawn anyone to it. Kjell, in 2 weeks of working the parcel, had not even known the clearing existed. It did not appear on any Forest Service map he had checked. It did not appear on the parcel's harvest plan. In the center of the clearing, partially overgrown by 15 years of forest reclamation, stood the remains of a small structure. It was a cabin. It was small, roughly 12 feet by 16 feet. Kjell's quick visual estimate. It was built of weathered wooden boards on a base of natural fieldstone, with corrugated metal sheets covering what remained of the roof. A section of the roof had collapsed at some point, and small trees had begun to grow through the opening. The walls were leaning slightly. The boards were gray with age. The structure had clearly been built decades ago and had been abandoned at some point. The forest had been reclaiming it slowly ever since. Kjell did not move for several seconds. He had walked thousands of miles through the superior national forest in his career. He had encountered, over the years, a dozen abandoned hunting cabins of similar construction. Small, hand-built shelters that had once belonged to private hunters, trappers, or guide operators, often dating from the early to mid-20th century. The Forest Service maintained records of all such structures within its boundaries. Most had been documented, mapped, and either left in place for historical reasons or removed during land management actions. Kjell knew the Forest Service records for this parcel. He had reviewed them carefully before beginning the timber cruise 2 weeks earlier. There was no recorded structure of any kind within the 240 acres he was working. The records were clear. The cabin he was looking at, partially hidden in a forgotten depression in the middle of the parcel, was not supposed to be there. He approached it slowly. The clearing around the cabin was littered with a kind of debris that accumulated around long-abandoned structures. Small pieces of corroded metal, an old tin can, a broken porcelain plate, the remains of what might once have been a small stovepipe. The vegetation was lower in the clearing than in the surrounding forest, suggesting that the area had once been kept clear by use, and that it was slowly being reclaimed but had not yet reached the density of the surrounding woods. He reached the cabin's small front door. Tent. The door was hanging open on one rusted hinge. The other hinge had failed years ago, and the door was tilted at an angle, partly resting against the doorframe. The opening was just large enough for a person to step through. Kell stood at the doorway and looked inside. The interior was small, dark, and surprisingly intact. The cabin had a single room. Against one wall, a wooden bunk frame had been built into the structure. 2 levels, the upper bunk partially collapsed. Against the opposite wall, a small rusted wood stove sat on a stone base. The stovepipe had fallen off at some point and was lying on the floor beside the stove. Near the wood stove, a small metal pail was on its side. Tirkin. The floor was packed dirt covered in years of accumulated leaf litter and small drifts of windblown debris. In the center of the floor, near the bunk frame, partially buried in the leaf litter, Kell could see something that made him stop breathing for a moment. It was a small green notebook. It was lying open, face down, with its cover stained dark from years of moisture and decay. The pages visible at the edges were curled and warped. The notebook was small, about the size of a paperback book, and even from the doorway, Kell could see that it was a moleskine tee with the elastic band still partially intact. He did not enter the cabin. He had worked in the deep woods long enough and had read enough about the cases that emerged from the deep woods over the years to know what kinds of things should not be touched. He had also, like every Minnesotan who had been reading newspapers for 15 years, an awareness of the Halverson case that ran like a low background hum beneath everything else he knew about his region. He had not consciously connected the cabin to the Halverson case in the moment he first saw it. But he understood, looking through the door at the green notebook in the leaf litter, that he was not going to handle this discovery himself. He stepped back from the doorway. He walked away from the cabin, back across the clearing, back through the stand of aspen, back across the ravine, back to the grid line he had been working. He did not run. He had been working in the woods for too long to run. But he walked steadily, with purpose, truck all the way back to his pickup truck at the operations base. The walk back took 23 minutes. He arrived at his truck at 12:08 p.m. He sat in the cab of the truck for a moment, organizing his thoughts. Then he took out his satellite phone. He did not call 911. He called his foreman, Loren Weiss, a 58-year-old man who had been with North Star Forest Products for nearly 40 years. Loren answered on the second ring. Kell told him, in the calm, deliberate voice he had cultivated over 28 years of working alone in remote terrain, that he had found something in the harvest area that the Forest Service and possibly law enforcement needed to come see. He did not say what he had found, he said, only that it was a structure that was not on any map, that it appeared to have been abandoned for many years, and that there was something inside the structure that he believed should not be disturbed. Before the appropriate authorities arrived, Loren did not ask for details. He had worked with Kell for 19 years. He had learned in those 19 years that when Kell Onstad said something needed law enforcement, he was not exaggerating, and he was not jumping to conclusions, and there was no point in asking questions over a satellite phone. Loren told Kell to stay where he was. He told him he would call the Forest Service directly and ask them to dispatch a ranger immediately. He told him he would call the company's legal office to make sure proper protocols were followed. He told him not to enter the structure again and not to disturb anything around it. Kell agreed. The first Forest Service ranger arrived at the operations base at 2:47 p.m., about 2.5 hours after Kell's call. The ranger was a woman named Tegan Sorley, 36 years old, who had been with the Forest Service in the Superior National Forest District for 8 years. Lauren Weiss had reached her supervisor in Ely, had dispatched her with a particular urgency that she had not entirely understood until Kell explained the situation to her face-to-face. Kell walked her into the cabin. They did not speak much during the hike. Tegan was carrying her standard ranger equipment, plus a small camera, a flashlight, and a satellite communicator of her own. They approached the cabin from the same direction Kell had originally found it. Tegan stood in the clearing for a long moment, taking in the structure. She had been a ranger for 8 years. She knew the location records for this section of the forest. She had no record of any cabin. She approached the door. She did not enter. She looked inside with her flashlight. She saw the bunk frame, the wood stove, the green notebook on the floor. She turned to Kell. She asked him carefully whether he had touched anything. He said no. She turned around. She walked back about 20 feet from the cabin. She took out her satellite communicator. She called her supervisor in Ely. She spoke for about 3 minutes. She described what she was looking at. She described what was on the floor. She described the location. When she ended the call, she turned to Kell. She told him, in a voice that was steady, but had something new in it that had not been there during the hike in, that the Cook County Sheriff's Department and the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension were being notified. She told him that they would likely need a forensic team. She told him that they would need to seal off the area. She did not say the name. She did not need to. Kell understood. He had understood since the moment he had seen the notebook. By 6 o'clock that evening, the operations base, where Kell had parked his truck, had become the staging area for what would, within 72 hours, become one of the most significant forensic investigations in the history of the Superior National Forest. By the morning of October 11th, an FBI evidence response team had arrived from Minneapolis. By October 12th, the entire 40-acre section of forest containing the cabin had been cordoned off, with Forest Service personnel maintaining a perimeter, and a careful, methodical excavation had begun. What that excavation would uncover over the following 6 weeks, what it would reveal about the morning of July 18, 2009, about a small float plane landing on Otter Lake, about 5 cousins held in a hand-built cabin in the deep woods for 5 days, about the careful, terrified entries written in a 13-year-old's notebook, and about the ultimate fate of all 5 children, would be the unimaginable truth that the Halverson family had spent 15 years preparing themselves not to discover. The forensic investigation began in earnest on the morning of October 11, 2024, and it would continue in active field operations until late November of that year. The investigation was led by the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, with significant participation from the FBI's Minneapolis field office and ongoing support from the Cook County Sheriff's Department. The lead BCA investigator was Special Agent Lynn Quist-Burgesson, a 48-year-old who had been with the agency for 20 years and who had handled multiple high-profile homicide and missing persons cases throughout Minnesota. The lead FBI agent was Special Agent Daniel Holub, 52, who had taken over the Halvorsen case from Carla Mottinger when she had retired in 2019. The forensic anthropologist assigned to the case was Dr. Bridget Kvarmy, 64, of the University of Minnesota, an expert in skeletal recovery from forest environments who had testified in 57 criminal cases over her career. The first phase of the investigation focused on the cabin itself. The structure was photographed exhaustively before any interior work began. Drone imagery was used to document the cabin from above. Surveyors mapped the structure and the surrounding clearing to a precision of 1 centimeter. The team then began, slowly and methodically, the interior recovery. The cabin's contents told a story. The wooden bunk frame against the wall had been used. The lower bunk showed wear patterns consistent with regular use. Depressions in the wood, faded stains from decades of weight. The upper bunk had partially collapsed at some point, but showed similar wear in its remaining sections. The small rusted wood stove showed thick interior soot accumulation consistent with years, possibly decades, of use. The metal pail near the stove had a thin residue inside that, when tested, contained traces of wood ash, suggesting it had been used as a fire-tending tool. The cabin was not a recent construction. The forensic team determined, through a combination of dendrochronology on the wooden framing and material analysis of the corrugated metal roofing, that the cabin had been built sometime between 1986 and 1992. The lumberyard tags on a few preserved interior boards were eventually traced to a small lumberyard in Grand Marais that had operated under family ownership from 1971 to 2008. The lumberyard's records, when accessed through the family that had once owned it, showed several cash purchases of construction lumber by a man named Verlin Alquist in 1988 and 1989. The cabin was not on any property record. The land it sat on was technically Superior National Forest land, but the cabin had been built in a remote section of the forest before modern GPS-based mapping had become standard, and it had simply never been documented. The Forest Service's older paper records did not include the structure. The cabin had been, in effect, invisible. It had also been used. The forensic team's analysis of the cabin's interior, combined with subsequent analysis of the surrounding forest, revealed that the cabin had been an active site of human activity from approximately the late 1980s until at least 2009. The activity had not been continuous. The cabin had not been a residence, but it had been used periodically in stays lasting from a few days to several weeks, over a span of roughly 20 years. What had happened in the cabin during those years would, in part, never be fully known. The investigation was able to establish, through later evidence and confessions, that the cabin had been used by Verlin Alquist as a base for what investigators would eventually classify as a small-scale human trafficking operation, specifically, the temporary holding of abducted persons before their transport to other locations for purposes that included sexual assault, and, in at least the case of the Halverson cousins, eventual homicide. The investigation eventually identified, through DNA recovery and other evidence, presence of at least 7 different victims who had been held in the cabin over the years prior to the Halvorsen case. 3 of those victims were eventually linked to other unsolved missing persons cases from the upper Midwest, dating between 1992 and 2007. The remaining 4 were never identified. But the centerpiece of the cabin investigation was the small green notebook on the floor. The notebook was recovered with extraordinary care on October 12, 2024, the second day of active excavation. It was transported in a special climate-controlled container to the Minnesota State Crime Lab in St. Paul, where it was handed over to a forensic document examiner named Dr. Wilma Carbo. Dr. Carbo had been working on document recovery from degraded crime scenes for 23 years. She had handled some of the most difficult recoveries in the upper Midwest. The notebook was in poor condition, but better condition than the team had feared. The cabin's interior, despite the partial roof collapse, had remained largely dry, trim. The notebook had been protected from direct exposure to weather by its position on the floor near the bunk frame, tray, where it had been buried under accumulated leaf litter and small drifts of windblown debris. The leather moleskine cover had absorbed some moisture over the years, but the pages themselves, paper of relatively good quality, written in a soft pencil that had not bled or faded significantly, had been preserved well enough that with careful work they could be read. Dr. Carbo and her team worked on the notebook for 19 days. They separated the pages with specialized tools, stabilized each page with archival quality treatments, and photographed every page at high resolution under multiple lighting conditions. They produced both physical and digital reproductions of every entry. The notebook contained 142 separate entries spanning approximately 18 months, from January 2008 through July 23, 2009. True. The early entries were ordinary 13-year-old observations, descriptions of school, sketches of birds and plants, lists of books Wren wanted to read, short paragraphs of personal reflection. The notebook had been a constant companion in Wren's daily life, and the early entries reflected the texture of a normal, observant adolescence. The final 23 entries told a different story. The first of those final entries was dated July 18, 2009, at 7:42 p.m. It was the same entry the investigators had read at the original campsite on the North Peninsula of Otter Lake on the morning of July 19, 2009, describing the sunset, the loons, the fire, Theo's fox track, the sandwiches, the cards. The notebook the cousins had used at the campsite, which had been recovered and held in evidence for 15 years, had been a different one. Wren had carried 2 notebooks, it now appeared. One for ordinary entries that she had been comfortable showing to others, and a second one, the green moleskine 10, that she had been keeping more privately. With deeper thoughts and personal observations she had not shared, the investigators had not known about the second notebook in 2009. They had not had any reason to suspect it existed. The next entry in the green notebook was dated July 18, 2009, but the timestamp Wren had recorded was different. Late, hidden intent, The handwriting was less steady than her usual writing, but it was unmistakably hers. A float plane just landed on the lake. 2 men got out. They are walking up the path now. Anders is talking to them. They say they are rangers. They are not wearing uniforms. Something is wrong. The next entry, also dated July 18th, was written in a different hand, shakier, with letters more pressed into the paper. They have guns. They made us get in the plane. We are flying. Eli says it is okay. I am writing this in my pocket. The investigators, when they read those entries for the first time on November 4th, 2024. After Dr. Carbo's team had finished their initial transcription, sat in a conference room in St. Paul, and did not speak for a long time, the remaining entries continued through July 19th, 20th, 21st, 22nd, and 23rd, 2009. They were brief. They were written, in many cases, in fragmented sentences. They were written in conditions of limited light, in moments when Wren had been able to conceal the notebook and write without being observed. They were written by a 13-year-old girl who had been kidnapped at gunpoint from a family camping trip and held in a hand-built cabin in the deep woods, who had nonetheless managed, over the course of 5 days, to document what was happening to her and her cousins with a clarity and a discipline that the investigators found almost impossible to comprehend. The entries described the 2 men. The older one was tall, bearded, in his 50s, the one in charge. The younger one was shorter, in his 30s, with a quieter manner. He doesn't speak much, but he does what the older one says. The entries describe the cabin. Small, one room, dirt floor. Smells like smoke and damp. Train. The entries describe the cousins' efforts to stay calm, to keep each other reassured, to plan what they might do if an opportunity for escape presented itself. Illy is being a good leader. He talks to them like he is not afraid. He keeps me and Theo behind him. Anders prays sometimes when they are not looking. Maren is the calmest of all of us. Tesh. She tells me to remember everything I see in case it is useful later. The entries described small acts of resistance. Eli had attempted, on the second day, to negotiate with the older man, offering money, asking what would secure their release. The older man had not responded. Anders had tried, on the third day, to talk with the younger man, who had seemed more uncertain than the older one. The younger man had refused to engage. Maren had been quietly working, throughout the 5 days, to memorize details of the cabin and the surrounding terrain that might help searchers later. Theo, the youngest, had been frightened. Wren wrote about him with particular care. Theo is 12. He is not as old as the rest of us, but he is being so brave. He sleeps next to me at night. He plays his harmonica, very quietly, during the day when the older man is not in the cabin. He says he wants to see his mom. We all want to see our moms. Tay. The entries became sparser over the final 2 days. The handwriting deteriorated. The light in the cabin had been limited, and the cousins had become exhausted from inadequate food, sleep deprivation, terror, and the sustained terror of their situation. But Wren had continued to write. The final entry was dated July 23, 2009. The handwriting was very faint. Tired. The pencil had been pressed lightly into the paper, possibly because Wren had been writing in near darkness, possibly because her hand had been unsteady from cold and exhaustion. The entry occupied the last 2 pages of the notebook. They said, "Today they are going to move us tomorrow." They did not say where. Eli says we have to try something. He says if we do not try, Tay will take us somewhere we cannot come back from. Maren agrees. Anders agrees. Theo is scared, but he agrees. I am writing this in case we cannot. Callan. I am hiding the notebook in the corner, under the loose board where I hid the harmonica yesterday. If you find this notebook, please tell our parents. Please tell them we did not give up. Please tell them we were together. Please tell them we love them. Eli loves Mark and Christine. Maren loves Inga and David. Anders loves Eric and Lena. Theo loves David and Karen. I love Joel and Merritt. If you find this, tell them all of us love them. Tell them we tried. Wren Halverson, the forensic anthropology investigation, working in parallel with the document recovery, focused on the forest surrounding the cabin. The investigators understood that the cousins had been moved or had attempted to move on the morning of July 24, 2009. Whatever had happened on that morning had not been recorded. In the notebook had been hidden under the loose board on the night of July 23rd. The cousins, whatever they had attempted, had not been able to retrieve it. Dr. Kavarmi and her team conducted a systematic search of the forest within a 2-mile radius of the cabin, using ground-penetrating radar, cadaver dog teams, and traditional forensic archaeology methods. The search took 6 weeks. It was conducted under increasingly cold autumn conditions, and the team had to work carefully to avoid disturbing what evidence remained. Over the course of the 6 weeks, the team identified and excavated 5 separate burial sites. The first site was located approximately 300 yards north of the cabin, beneath a small rock outcrop. The remains were partial skeletal remains of a young adolescent, personal items, including a small wooden cross. DNA analysis, completed on November 13, 2024, confirmed the remains were Anders Halverson, Tanner. The second site was located approximately 700 yards east of the cabin, in a small depression at the base of a large white pine. The remains were of a young adult male, Personal items included the partial remains of a University of Minnesota brochure that had been folded into a back pocket. DNA confirmed the remains were Eli Halvorsen. The third site was approximately a half-mile west of the cabin. The remains were of a young adolescent female. A silver bracelet was recovered. The remains were Maren Halvorsen Lynn, 10. The fourth site was approximately a mile southwest of the cabin. The remains were of a young adolescent female. The remains had been buried with a small zipper pouch that, when carefully opened, contained the remains of a swimming medal. The remains were Ren Halvorsen. The fifth site was the smallest and the most carefully concealed. It was located in a tangle of fallen deadfall about a quarter-mile north of the cabin. The remains were of a young adolescent male, smaller than the others. Among the personal items recovered was a small wooden harmonica. The remains were Theo Halvorsen. All 5 sets of remains showed indications of cause of death by gunshot. Forensic ballistic analysis identified the weapon as a .22 caliber rifle. The placement and angle of the wounds were consistent with what investigators would later characterize as a controlled disposition. The kind of pattern that emerged in cases where victims had been killed quickly, in sequence, by a single shooter at close range. The cousins had not died of exposure. They had not escaped and become lost in the forest. They had been killed. Dr. Kavarmi's analysis indicated that the killings had likely occurred on the morning of July 24, 2009, the morning after Ren's final notebook entry. The cousins had apparently attempted some kind of escape, as Ren had foreshadowed in her final entry. The escape had failed. They had been recaptured, almost certainly within minutes, and they had been killed shortly afterward. The investigation now turned to identifying the 2 men described in Ren's notebook. The older man, the bearded one, had been identified almost immediately in the working hypotheses of the investigators as Verlin Ahlquist. Ahlquist had been the prime suspect in the Halvorsen case for 15 years. He had died in 2021. His DNA had been retained in the Minnesota State DNA database as part of the unrelated 2014 conviction for which he had served prison time. DNA samples recovered from the cabin, from the bunk frame, the wood stove, the metal pail, and several other interior surfaces, were compared with Ahlquist's database sample. The match was conclusive. Verlin Ahlquist had been in the cabin extensively. He had built it. He had used it. He had been there in the summer of 2009. The younger man, the shorter one in his 30s, the one Ren had described as the one who doesn't speak much, was harder to identify. The forensic team recovered partial DNA samples from the cabin that did not match Ahlquist. They also recovered partial DNA from one of the burial sites that did not match Ahlquist. The samples, run through state and federal databases, did not produce an immediate match. The investigators turned instead to Ahlquist's personal connections. They examined his family history. They examined his known associates. They looked at every individual who could be placed in regular contact with Ahlquist during the relevant period. The breakthrough came in mid-November 2024. Ahlquist's sister, Margit Tay, had been interviewed multiple times during the original 2009 investigation and several times in the years since. She had always maintained that she had no useful knowledge of her brother's activities. She was 74 years old in November 2024, living in Ely. When the investigators returned to her with the new evidence from the cabin, the notebook, the burial sites, the DNA recovery, something in her gave way. She told the agents, in a single long interview on November 17th, that there was someone they should look at. She said she had not mentioned him before because she had not been sure, and because she had not wanted to make accusations without evidence. She said her brother had had a nephew, her son, who had been in regular contact with Verlin for many years. She said her son had been a troubled young man. She said she had not spoken to her son in over a decade. She gave the agents his name and his last known location. His name was Lyle Holland. He was Margit's son from her first marriage. T had taken his stepfather's last name. He was 51 years old in 2024. He had a small criminal history, drug-related convictions in the early 2000s, but nothing in the years since. He was living in a small town in northern Wisconsin, where he had been working as a maintenance worker at a recreational vehicle park for the past 9 years. He lived alone. He had no significant social presence. The FBI's Milwaukee field office, in coordination with the Minnesota BCA, conducted surveillance on Holland for 9 days before approaching him. They obtained a covert DNA sample on November 28th. From a discarded coffee cup at a gas station Holland stopped at on his way to work. The sample was rushed to the Minnesota State Crime Lab. The match was confirmed on December 5, 2024. Lyle Holland's DNA matched the unknown samples recovered from the cabin and from one of the burial sites. Holland was arrested at his apartment in Wisconsin on December 8, 2024. He was transported to Minneapolis. He was advised of his rights. He was interviewed by Special Agent Holub and Special Agent Quist Bergeson over 3 days, December 9th through 11th, with his attorney present. He confessed. He told the investigators that his uncle, Verlin Alquist, had been operating the cabin in the deep woods since the late 1980s. He told them that the cabin had been used as a holding location for a small number of victims over the years. Adolescents and young adults, mostly female but including some males, who had been taken from various points in the Boundary Waters region and held briefly before being transported to other locations. He told them that he had been involved peripherally in his uncle's activities since he was in his early 20s. He told them that the Halverson case had been different, that his uncle had not planned the abduction, that it had been opportunistic. According to Holland's confession, his uncle had been flying over Otter Lake on the afternoon of July 18, 2009, on a routine reconnaissance flight. He had seen the cousins paddling north from the compound. He had landed at the cabin's adjacent small lake, a body of water called North Pond, which had a small but workable area for floatplane landings, and had told Holland that there was an opportunity. 2 men had taken Verlin's plane to Otter Lake at approximately 7:30 p.m. on July 18th. They had landed on the lake about a half-mile from the peninsula campsite. They had approached the cousins on foot, claiming to be Forest Service rangers. They had been armed. They had forced the 5 cousins into the floatplane at gunpoint. Cousins had been flown to the cabin's adjacent lake. They had been walked through the forest to the cabin, where they had been held for 5 days. The 2 men had taken turns watching them, cabin, with the cabin's location ensuring that no outside searcher would find them. Holland described in halting language the conditions of the 5 days. He described the cousins as having been compliant but never broken. He described Eli's leadership. He described Anders's calm. He described Marin's quiet intelligence. He described Wren's careful watchfulness. He described Theo as having been the most frightened of the 5, but as having been protected at every turn by his older cousins. On the morning of July 24th, cousins had attempted an escape. Eli had created a distraction. The cousins had broken out of the cabin and had run into the forest. They had been caught within minutes. The cabin was deep enough in the wilderness that there had been nowhere for them to run. Verlin and Holland had been familiar with the terrain in ways the cousins were not. The cousins had been recaptured, separated, and killed individually in different locations in the surrounding forest. The killings had been done with a .22 caliber rifle that Verlin had owned for many years. The bodies had been buried in shallow graves in 5 different locations, with the burial site selected by Verlin for their concealment. Tolland told the investigators that he had carried the knowledge for 15 years. He told them he had thought about coming forward many times. He told them he had not been able to. Told them. His uncle had threatened him explicitly in the years before Verlin's death in 2021 with violence against Holland's mother and against Holland himself if he ever spoke. After Verlin's death, Holland said he had thought about coming forward but had been unable to bring himself to do it. He told them he was sorry. He told them he had not slept properly in 15 years. Lyle Holland was charged on December 12, 2024, with 5 counts of first-degree murder, 5 counts of kidnapping, and additional charges related to his uncle's broader criminal enterprise. He pleaded guilty in March 2025 to avoid the death penalty, which Minnesota does not have, but which federal charges could have brought, and accepted a sentence of 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole. The Halverson families were notified of the recovery of the remains, the identification of the perpetrators, and the confession in a series of personal meetings in late November and early December 2024. Sheriff Mara Tellefson, Special Agent Quist Bergeson, and Special Agent Holub coordinated the notifications. Each family was notified separately, in person, in the homes of the families. Tark and Christine Halverson were notified together at Christine's apartment in Minneapolis. They had been preparing themselves for 15 years for various possibilities, but they had not been able to prepare themselves for the specific reality that emerged. They listened to the entire account. They asked questions about Eli, about whether he had suffered, about whether he had been brave at the end. The investigators told them what they could tell them, based on Holland's confession and the forensic evidence. They told them that Eli had been the leader of the cousins throughout the ordeal. They told them that he had organized the escape attempt. They told them that he had died protecting his cousins. Inga, Halverson Lynn, and David Lynn were notified at their home outside 2 Harbors. Inga listened in silence for nearly the entire conversation. When the investigators finished, she asked one question: whether Marin had been calm at the end. The investigators told her, based on Wren's notebook entries and Holland's confession, that Marin had been the calmest of the 5 throughout, and that she had spent the 5 days quietly memorizing details that she had hoped might help searchers later. Inga nodded once. She thanked the investigators. She stood up. She walked into another room and did not come out for over an hour. Eric and Lena Halverson were notified at their home in Duluth. Eric, too, who had wrestled with his faith for 15 years, listened to the account with his hands folded in his lap. When the investigators told him about Anders praying when the men were not watching, Eric did not cry, but his hands gripped each other tightly. He told the investigators, very quietly, that he had been afraid for 15 years that Anders had died alone and afraid. He said that what they had told him, that Anders had not been alone, that he had been with his cousins, that he had been faithful to who he was throughout, was the answer to a prayer he had been afraid to pray. Jewel and Merritt Halverson were notified at their home in Grand Marais. Merritt, who had read Wren's previous notebook many times over the 15 years, asked the investigators about the green moleskine. They told her, gently, that she would be given access to a digital copy of every entry, and that the original notebook would eventually be made available to her after it had completed its role as evidence. They told her about Wren's final entry. They read it aloud to her. At her request, with Joel sitting beside her on the couch holding her hand. Merritt did not speak when they finished. She sat for a long time. When she finally spoke, she asked the investigators to tell her in their own words what Wren had been like in those final days. The investigators did, Tan. They told her that Wren had been the documentarian, the observer, the careful keeper of the truth. They told her that Wren had been a 13-year-old girl who, in conditions that would have broken many adults, had remembered who she was and what mattered, and had written it down for her parents to find. David and Karen Halverson were notified last, their home in Grand Marais. Karen, who had carried the particular weight of having said yes to the camping trip, listened to the account with her husband's arm around her shoulders. The investigators told her about Theo. They told her that Theo had been frightened, that he had been the youngest, that he had wanted to see her, but that his older cousins had protected him, Tan, and that he had been brave in his own quiet way, and that he had been with the people who loved him at the end. They told her about the harmonica, which had been recovered with his remains. Karen broke for the first time in the conversation. She had not cried that any of her family had seen for nearly 5 years. She cried for nearly 20 minutes in the investigators' presence. They did not interrupt her. They sat with her. David held her. When she had recovered, she thanked them and asked them to leave so she could have time alone with her husband. The funerals were held over a 2-week period in late December 2024 and early January 2025. The families had decided, after many conversations, to bury all 5 cousins together in a single shared section of the family cemetery in Two Harbors. The cemetery was small, a Lutheran cemetery on a low hill overlooking Lake Superior, and the Halverson family had several generations buried there. There was a section that had been reserved for the family for over a century. The 5 cousins were buried side by side. In that section, in a row, in the order they had paddled away from the compound on the afternoon of July 18, 2009. Eli first, then Maren, then Anders, then Wren, then Theo, the headstone, when it was installed in the spring of 2025, was a single long granite marker that bore all 5 names, their dates of birth, and the single date, July 24, 2009, that had been determined to be the date of their deaths. Beneath the names, an inscription chosen by all 4 families together had been carved into the stone in Norwegian and English. It read, "De gikk sammen. De kommer hjem sammen." They went together. They come home together. The funeral services themselves had been simple. Eric Halvorsen had led the prayers. Joel Halvorsen had played a song on his guitar that he had written for Wren in the years after her disappearance. Christine Halvorsen had read aloud, with permission from the other families, the final entry from Wren's notebook. Mark Halvorsen had spoken briefly about Eli. Inga Halvorsen Lynn had spoken about Maren. Karen Halvorsen had spoken about Theo. Eric had spoken about Anders, too. They had not all been able to speak through every word, but they had spoken what they had needed to speak, and the small congregation gathered at the cemetery. Over 400 people, including extended Halvorsen family from across the country, members of the original 2009 search teams, Sheriff Stensley, now in retirement, Sheriff Tellefsen, the BCA agents, Kjell Onstad, and his wife Astrid, who had been quietly invited by Joel Halvorsen, had listened in silence. Kjell Onstad did not speak at the funeral. He stood at the back of the small congregation. He had been invited only because Joel Halvorsen had wanted to thank him in person, and Joel had decided that the funeral was the right place to do it. After the burial, Joel walked over to where Kjell was standing with his wife. He shook Kjell's hand. He did not say much. He thanked him for finding the cabin. He thanked him for not entering it. He thanked him for understanding what kind of thing it was. Kjell, who was not a talkative man, told Joel that he was sorry. He said it was the only thing he could think to say. Joel nodded. T thanked him. Again, he returned to his family. The Five Cousins Foundation, in the years that followed, transformed its mission. It had been founded in 2009 to support continued investigation of the cousins' disappearance. It had funded 15 years of search efforts that had ultimately not located the cousins. With the case now resolved, the foundation refocused. It became, in 2025 and afterward, an advocacy organization dedicated to two related missions. First, supporting the families of missing persons in wilderness and rural areas across the United States. And second, advocating for legislative reform of unregistered backcountry properties and unlicensed guide services that could be used to conceal criminal activity in remote regions. The foundation lobbied successfully between 2025 and 2027 for federal legislation requiring all structures on federal forest land, including private structures predating modern mapping, to be registered and inspected. The legislation, known informally as the Five Cousins Act, passed Congress in 2027 and was signed into law by the President in 2028. Merritt Halverson attended the signing ceremony. Ren Halverson's green notebook was preserved at the Minnesota Historical Society in a special collection devoted to missing persons cases that had been resolved through unusual means. The notebook itself was sealed in archival conditions and could be viewed by researchers under controlled circumstances. A facsimile copy was given to each of the four Halverson families. The original entries, written in a careful 13-year-old's handwriting, in moments of terror and discipline and love, became one of the most quietly devastating documents in the modern history of Minnesota. The final entry, in particular, Trey, was reproduced in news coverage of the case and in eventual academic studies of the case, where it was discussed, not as evidence but as a kind of testament, a record of what five children had been and what they had loved, written by the youngest of them in the hours before they had attempted, together, to come home. Otter Lake was visited by what remained of the Halverson family one final time on July 18, 2025, on the 16th anniversary of the disappearance and the first anniversary since the discovery. They paddled out to the memorial dock on the North Peninsula. The 5 wooden canoe paddles were still there. The families did not replace them. They added that day a small bronze plaque to the platform of the dock. The plaque was simple. It read Illy, Marin, Anders, Ren, Theo Halverson. Last camped here, July 18, 2009. Found and brought home, 2024. Together always, the families paddled back across the lake at sunset. They reached the south shore as the last light was fading from the western tree line. They drove back down the gravel road into the wilderness in a small caravan of vehicles, and they turned south at the highway toward home. Behind them, the Boundary Waters held its long silence, 1,000,000 acres of forest and water, dark and ancient, the same wilderness that had held the cousins' silence for 15 years, and had, in the end, given them back. The wind moved through the white pines on the North Peninsula. The loons called from somewhere in the eastern bay. The lake was calm. Otter Lake itself had never contained the cousins. The lake had been searched for 15 years with every available technology, and had given up nothing because nothing had ever been there to give up. The cousins had been 17 miles away, in a hand-built cabin that no map had recorded, in a clearing in a small bowl-shaped depression that no searcher had reached. They had been hidden by the geography of an enormous wilderness and by the careful malice of 2 men in a place that should not have existed. They had been found, in the end, not by satellite or sonar or helicopter or dog. They had been found because a forest logger named Kjell Onstad had walked through a stand of young aspen on a cold October morning. Trand had seen a single horizontal line through the trees that did not belong. Tan, and had understood, in the way that careful people sometimes understand, that the line was something he should not handle alone. The wilderness keeps its secrets for a long time, but it does not keep them forever. And in the end, on a 15-year journey that had begun with 5 cousins paddling away from a family dock on a windless July afternoon, and had ended with 5 names carved into a single granite stone on a hill above Lake Superior, the Halverson family had been given back what every family of the missing waits against all hope to be given back: the simple, terrible, blessed knowledge of where their children had gone, and the chance at last to bring them home. De Gik Samen, de kommer hem samen. They went together, they come home together.